Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Archbishop. Every Archbishop of New York has thus far been Irish by either birth or heritage. Each in their own way, these sons of St. Patrick have been saints and sinners, politicians and pastors, movers and shakers, and they've shaped the city and, frankly, the rest of the nation. We're joined by George Marlin to talk about these amazing men, or these historic men. George Marlin is chairman of Aid to the Church in Need U.S.A. He's a former executive director of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, and he's a contributing editor to The Catholic Thing, an author and editor of several books, including the one we're talking about today, Sons of St. Patrick, a history of the Archbishops of New York from Dagger John to Timmytown. George, thank you very much for making the time to speak with us. Before we talk about specific bishops and the entire journey and evolution of the office, I'd like to invite you to speak to the Irish Catholic heritage in New York as a general concept.
Well, it's been an Irish church for most of its history in New York when it became an archdiocese under Archbishop Hughes. But during the potato famine, New York, like Boston, tens of thousands of Irish came. And of course, you had the old Anglo-Saxons who controlled this city politically back in those days. And so there was always a lot of bigotry, a lot of nativism. And we only saw that not only in New York, but certainly in Boston and in Philadelphia. But it was Archbishop John Hughes, known as Dagger Hughes, because the little cross the bishop puts when he signs his name was interpreted as a dagger by the anti-Catholics in New York. But back in the 1840s, when the anti-nativist movement was at its height and anti-Catholicism was the sort of way of doing things, after the cathedral in Philadelphia was burnt down, Archbishop Hughes made it clear to the city of New York and its mayor, who was a blatant anti-Catholic, that if any church in New York should be burnt, or any Catholic institution, because up in Boston they burnt down a Ursuline orphanage house, and many kids died in that fire. He said, quote unquote, that New York City will look like Moscow in 1812 when Napoleon left it. And that sort of quieted things down. So throughout our history, the history of the city of New York, and I grew up in the city of New York and ran for mayor in New York City back in 1993. I lost. But the Irish have made an incredible contribution, but they sort of introduced what we would call the political machine. And I am not anyone who dislikes it. Daniel Patrick Moynihan once pointed out the gift of the Irish was their ability to organize. And they organized neighborhoods and political clubs and parishes. And as people were coming off the boat going through Ellis Island, the Irish politicians gave what we would call a helping hand, not a hand out. And in return, they were loyal to the local organization. And the city of New York and the state of New York was dominated by Irish through most of the late 19th century and most of the early 20th century. So they have had a tremendous impact on the city. In the post-World War II period, for instance, 50% of New Yorkers were Catholic, 25% were Jewish, and about 16% Protestant. And of that 50% of Catholics in New York, probably at that time, post-World War II, about 60% of them were Irish or of Irish heritage. So, no, the Irish were the Church in New York, ran the Church in New York, and ran the political machines in New York. And I think when we look back at the times they did, putting aside the petty corruptions we know about, but they were a force of good in my judgment.
Considering the tenuous status of the Irish Catholics, especially in their early years in the United States, I want to invite you to speak to how that contributed to the shaping of the political and social milieu of New York.
Well, it was a period from the 19th century really until the 1960s. You know, I growing up in New York City in the early 50s, going to a Catholic grammar school, what the Irish did in the way they developed parishes, the parish was the center of life. There were two centers of life in the neighborhood, the parish and the local political club, generally a Democratic club. The Irish were very democratic. And so they had a tremendous impact on preserving the neighborhoods. And let me tell you something, even in the 50s growing up, I went to St. Cyril's and Methodius Parish. That was our parish, our few square blocks. We didn't hang out with the kids that went to St. Alphonsus, 5 blocks away. It was very parochial. And parochial is not a pejorative term as many people think of it today. So again, they introduced basically the ground rules of the neighborhoods in the city, preserved those neighborhoods, and it wasn't until the Great Society years where suddenly we had all these social engineers coming into New York and telling us, community organizers like Barack Obama, et cetera, telling us how to organize the world, and they contributed to the urban decline. You know, at the end of the Second World War, when the GI Bill of Rights was passed, there was a piece of it that had housing benefits. So a veteran, like my father, was able to get a mortgage from the Federal Housing Administration / GI Bill of Rights. But when they wrote the legislation, the social engineers that wrote it, who were basically anti-Catholic, wrote it in such a way that if you lived in the inner city, you couldn't get one of those mortgages because under the law that was passed, the house had to have a minimum of 60 by 100 feet. Mm. And housing in New York was basically 20 by 60, 20 feet wide, the row houses. The objective was to break up the old neighborhoods, and of course then you had the real estate interests who owned all the suburban property, be it in Long Island or outside of Boston. And so they established lots of 60 by 100, Levittowns, etc. But the social engineers put their imprint on that because they hated the inner city Catholic neighborhoods, and they wanted to blow it up. And they succeeded. And in the 60s, you began to see a great decline in the neighborhoods. They try to blame it on racism and say, oh, people flocked to the suburbs because of racist, all those Catholics. No, it was because the GI Bill of Rights, where a guy could have a little house for his family. They were basically cookie-cutter houses. They left the city because of that housing bill, not due to racism or anything else. So the social engineers want to have their cake and eat it. They wanted to break up the Catholic neighborhoods and then accuse us of being racists because we moved out of the neighborhoods. You know, it was, ludicrous. But the decline we saw of a neighborhoods that succeeded in the city of New York worked, and you began to see a rundown to many of the slums like the South Bronx of yesteryear, et cetera. And so, those neighborhoods worked. The parishes worked. Parents worked together. Kids knew one another. And that's sad to say is long gone. Now we have high crime, drugs, etc., homeless, the mentally ill wandering the streets. It's not the way it was when I was growing up in Brooklyn.
So in the face of this, you've got the rebellion, the Leisler rebellion, amidst this entire legacy of prejudice. But you've got a few bishops that take center stage in shaping the socio-religious culture. Luke Concannon, the Dominican, and his successor after him. Tell us about their impact.
The early bishops really had no impact. The third Archbishop of New York, Archbishop Dubois, mm-hmm. and he was buried under the steps of the old St. Patrick's Cathedral in Lower Manhattan. And he said, the Irish can now walk over me in death as they walked over me in life. So those early years were very tough years, because you have to remember, the original law passed when New York State became an independent state, sovereign state after the American Revolution. It said there was a law that...
George, let's pause there because the music is hitting. My guest is George Marlin, chairman of Aid to the Church and Need U.S.A., and he is the author of this great book, Sons of St. Patrick, The History of the Bishops of New York. Stay tuned, I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. I'm talking with George Marlin, chairman of Aid to the Church and Need U.S.A. He's also the author of The Sons of St. Patrick. George, to pick up where the music had cut us off earlier, you were telling us about the first three archbishops of New York, and
they were the first three bishops.
oh yes, the first three
the
bishops.
first
That's right.
archbishop was John Hughes.
That's right.
Under the first three bishops, one never made it. He died before he got here. But the church was very tiny for a very simple reason. Up until 1784, there was a law on the books in New York State that forbid priests from residing in New York. That's how anti-Catholic the old Anglo-Saxon establishment was that controlled Albany, the state legislature, and the governor's office back in those times. It wasn't, the Catholic population was minuscule and did not begin to grow until the Irish diaspora in the 1880s, the potato famine, and John Joseph Hughes became the first Archbishop of New York. Now, his diocese then was the entire state of New York, and he was the metropolitan for New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. So several things happened. You have tens of thousands of Irish moving in. Churches are being built. Schools quite didn't happen until post-Civil War. There were some schools, and Hughes was fighting to get government dollars to help finance those schools because they didn't have the burden of having them in public schools. The Catholic schools started in the Archdiocese of New York primarily because the public schools were controlled by Protestants that were teaching the Protestant faith in city public schools. So Governor Seward of New York, who is not a Catholic but was sympathetic to Hughes, gave a helping hand for these schools to start. Come the Civil War, obviously tens of thousands of Irish, about 40% of the Union Army was Catholic during the Civil War. The Irish in general were opposed to slavery due to the oppression they lived under with the British. But you had a very unfair system of the draft in New York, the federal draft. A wealthy person, mostly Anglo-Saxons, were able to buy their way out of the draft. President Theodore Roosevelt's father bought his way out of the draft, paid an Irishman $200 to take his place. President Franklin Roosevelt's father paid $200 to have an Irishman take his place. President Grover Cleveland, he himself paid an Irishman $200 to take his place in the draft. In addition to that, the draft system took more people from the Irish-dominated congressional districts than the Anglo-Saxon districts. So there was the draft riots in New York City that took place when the Irish began destroying neighborhoods and destroying stores and storefronts and places, objecting to this unfair system. And it was Archbishop Hughes who called them to outside the old St. Patrick's and basically said, these riots are over. He is credited for stopping the riots in New York City. Hughes had a very good relationship with Abraham Lincoln. Hughes was able to get some messages and various other documents over to the Vatican on behalf of Abraham Lincoln. In fact, months before Hughes died at the end of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln had sent a letter to the Pope at the time, I guess that would be Pius IX, asking that he get a red hat. He died, and of course it didn't happen. His success was John Joseph McCluskey. McCluskey inherited a bit of a mess after the Civil War. There wasn't a great deal of money being raised, because of the draft and everything else. A lot of schools and churches were empty. More important, Hughes had started the building of St. Patrick's Cathedral, which was basically on the Upper East Side. People thought he was crazy because it was farmland. And he was wise enough to know that someday this is going to be something. And of course, where St. Patrick's is today is the highest, most valuable real estate in the world. But when the Civil War began, the only things that were up were several of the columns that are inside the church to this day. So McCluskey had the job of raising the money to finish the cathedral, straighten out the archdiocese. And the arguments we make, my colleague Brad Miner and I make in this book, is that each archbishop, we were lucky in New York to have someone who fit the bill for the times. McCluskey was much more low-key, but he straightened out the finances, rebuilt the church, and was, of course, the first American to get a red hat from the cardinal, become a cardinal archbishop of the Church of New York. During his administration, New York dioceses were being founded in Rochester, Buffalo area, Albany area, Syracuse area later on. So we began to see other dioceses being established, and the Archbishop of New York was the metropolitan for that area. When McCluskey died, Michael Augustine Corrigan, Augustine Corrigan, became the Archbishop of New York, and he did yeoman service for the Vatican, fighting the battle of Americanism in the United States, where there were clerics who thought we should conform to American norms and drop our identity as Catholics. And of course, under Pope Leo XIII, even though he put out some marvelous encyclicals on labor, etc., he somewhat opposed this Americanism of the church as McCluskey did. And so, again, he was a man for his times and did the right job objecting to these movements to infiltrate the church and try to secularize the church. After that, we have James Murphy Farley, and Cardinal Farley was Archbishop from 1902 to 1918. He was born in Ireland, came over here as a young lad. He was the first auxiliary bishop in New York. And during his time, again, you had a great movement of population coming to the United States, particularly to New York, and they weren't Irish. So between 1900 and 1920, 1 million Italians came to New York, 850,000 Poles came to New York, 800,000 Hungarians came to New York. And so, in addition to fighting the modernism battle at that time, he put together, sponsored the Catholic Encyclopedia, which was the authoritative books for decades to come. And on the 100th anniversary of the Archdiocese in 2008, New York was split up into 8 different dioceses at that point in time. But he built the ethnic parishes in New York, did an incredible job, was the first military archbishop of the United States when World War I broke out. And he took on the socialists and the Dorothy Day types. He took on the people supporting divorce, who wanted to stop taxing, wanted to tax church property. He took on the political anti-Catholic movements his time and did a pretty extraordinary job. He died on September 17th, 1918, but he was an extraordinary man for the time, and particularly as military archbishop, since once again, about 40% of the troops who served in the American Armed Forces during World War I were Catholic. You had the famous Irish Brigade, the Rainbow Brigade, which had the Irish Brigade of New York Irishmen who fought in the Civil War and fought as well in the First World War. So again, he was the man for the times. Do you want me to go on through all these guys? What do you want to do here?
We have basically 2 more historical periods, if you will, and you categorize the city and the world and the church at crisis. So just to give us a summary of the development of the office of Archbishop in New York.
Well, after Cardinal Farley died in 1908, Patrick Joseph Hayes became Archbishop of New York. He, too, had to put up with a particularly anti-Catholic bigotry at the time when Governor Al Smith in New York, he was a Democrat, the first nominee of a major Republican party to run for president. Anti-Catholicism during that period was awful. Al Smith driving a train out west campaigning. They were burning crosses along the flats of Kansas greeting him. That's how bad it was. And so Cardinal Hayes fought that battle again, building more churches, building more schools. And he died on the eve of World War II. And Pius XI was about to appoint a Midwestern bishop to fill the see. He died. And Pius XII ripped up the papers, issued new papers, and filled in the name of one Francis Spellman. They were very good friends for the years that Francis Spellman had lived in Rome, and that was one of the greatest decisions Pius XII ever made. Francis, later Cardinal Spellman, didn't become a cardinal until after the war. Pope Pius appointed no cardinals during the war. But Francis Spellman was sort of a short, balding guy, not a great orator, but an extraordinary man, in addition to being a brilliant administrator. People like Pius XII and President Roosevelt, who he was close to, Winston Churchill, General Dwight Eisenhower, General Douglas MacArthur. All these great men saw something in this man. And during the Second World War, he traveled tens and tens of thousands of miles as the military archbishop, flying all over the world. At one point, he was able to manage to get Mussolini to allow him into Italy to see Pius XII, ostensibly on church business in New York. He was the military archbishop. He managed to finagle that, and he and Pius XII spent about 10 days together getting briefed on what was going on in the world. In addition, back in the 30s, when Pope Pius XI released the anti-Nazi encyclical that he wrote, it was Francis Spellman who translated it into English. He was then a Monsignor. He sort of went incognito and brought it to Paris and gave it to the world as it was being released in Germany. And he spoke on the radio, American radio, about this encyclical. So we began a golden age under Spellman, which I'll be happy to continue talking about if we're doing another section.
No, that was the last segment, but gosh, thank you so much, George. This really was enlightening. My guest has been George Marlin, chairman of Aid to the Church and Need U.S.A. We've been talking about his book, The Sons of St. Patrick, History of the Archbishops of New York. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.